Sadame is essentially an action RPG, and despite its Japanese aesthetic, its gameplay actually shares quite a bit in common with the likes of Diablo. It sees you getting to choose from one of 4 characters, a ninja, monk, samurai or rogue, as you head out and take on a series of levels by slicing your way through hordes of monsters and the undead. Although the gameplay relatively stays the same no matter which character you choose, Sadame does a respectable job of trying to balance them out with varying playstyles, with some of them being more useful than others in specific situations. No matter which way you prefer to play, there's bound to be one that suits your approach. One aspect that promotes the use of each character is that any of the loot you gather during play carries over across saves. This way, if you find something specifically catered to one of the classes you're not playing as, you can use it when starting a run-up with them. The gameplay itself will see you hacking and slashing away, but you've also got a few magic abilities on hand as well. These abilities really come into play during some of the more impressive boss fights, and it's here that Sadame bursts into life. As I mentioned earlier, there's several RPG elements that allow you to level up. This is mainly done through a sphere grid system that sees the player spending points to advance. It's pretty open as well, and facilitates many different paths for the player to take and build their character. It reminds me a lot of Muramasa on the Vita, and although it never quite reaches the heights of that game, Sadame is still a great option if you're on the lookout for an action RPG to sink your teeth into. Crash City Mayhem was a continuation of the Runabout series that saw releases on the Dreamcast and PlayStation. Whilst it did drop the name, most likely to appeal to a wider audience in the West, Crash City is still the same great arcade fun as before. The closest comparison would be something like Crazy Taxi, with the game taking on a mission-based setup. The best thing about them is that there's a wide variety of objectives to take on. Sometimes you might have something as simple as stealing an item and reaching a drop-off point, or something as hard as stalking someone without getting too close or too distant. A little side objective of most missions is to of course cause as much havoc and damage as possible by ramming your car into stuff like park benches, restaurant stands, street lights and other cars, and as it gets destroyed, their monetary values get added to your score counter, which all contributes to your final tally on the board. Of course, it wouldn't be a driving game without an abundance of vehicles to jump into, and Crash City Mayhem delivers. You've got buses, sport cars, monster trucks, military tanks and many more that are all unlocked in a variety of ways, but mainly by completing each mission on its hardest setting. When it comes to the selling point of the 3DS, Crash City Mayhem is one of those games that do it justice. The 3D effect is potent, and although you won't be able to see it here on YouTube, seeing it in person is the only way to appreciate it, but some rather dodgy frame rate and pop-in issues hold it back. Luckily, it never really impacts the gameplay that much, and that's where Crash City excels. When it comes to quick pick up and play games on the 3DS, this one is a solid choice. From the same mind that brought us Radiant Silvergun and Ikaruga comes a shooter that on the surface may appear to be a slower paced experience than its predecessors, but Kakuga packs just as much of a punch and stands as proof that even a relatively simple idea can still be engaging even to this day. Right from the get-go, you get access to the game's 12 levels, which are all represented on a grid. Once you've completed one, you then move on to a connected level. There are some areas that serve as the final stages of the game, and it's possible to select an area next to it and then immediately take on the final stage. Of course, this wouldn't be a shooter without an array of weaponry to take advantage of, with it providing a rather unique take on the shooter norms. On the touchscreen, the player has 4 cards, each one representing different power-ups from 2 separate categories, both attack and support, ranging from rapid fire to shields and even a devastating final attack. These random cards can be used when touched, with another card replacing it each time you do. At the beginning, you receive a total of 20 cards for each level, and it's down to you when and how you use them. It adds an extra layer of strategy not often found with others, and the gameplay is more engaging because of it, with each of the levels lasting around 10 to 15 minutes, as well as the ability to select from multiple difficulties. There should be something here to please shooter fans of all skill levels. To top it off, there's a pretty decent multiplayer mode as well, which doesn't require everyone to own a copy of the game. Kakuga offers up a refreshing experience, with its simple and accessible mechanics, but with it also being able to provide a challenge at the same time that all players can enjoy. The 3DS was home to a wide selection of unique experiences, but one that has largely been forgotten is Attack of the Friday Monsters. It's primarily an adventure game that sees you filling the shoes of Sotu, a young boy whose family have just recently moved to a neighborhood in Tokyo. Now Sotu was growing up in a time, as the game explains, where children in Japan were obsessed with kaiju shows, and it just so happens that the town Sotu's family moves to has a TV studio where those same shows are made. The plot has a touch of magical realism to it that is strangely refreshing. On the one hand, there are the fantastical elements, such as the monsters and the marks they leave behind in the landscape, and the peculiar way in which the adults behave. On the other hand, the setting can also be quite down to earth, while offering more rational explanations for what is happening. A sense of childlike wonder is at the center of the experience, and is so easy to just get sucked into. Gameplay wise, it's all relatively simple, with it seeing you interact with the various townsfolk and exploring their lovingly drawn surroundings. There is a more traditional aspect to the gameplay in the form of a card game, which revolves around several of the monsters that the characters mention. It's a sort of rock paper scissors approach that sees you battling with others who possess cards as well. Players who take their time to explore the town will have the upper hand instantly, as many of the cards can be found hidden throughout the environment. It makes for a nice distraction from the adventure, which is made up of just over 20 episodes, and it won't take you long to finish, as completing the main story and the subsequent bonus episodes will take about 2 to 3 hours. And sure, that is quite short, but the game never overstays its welcome, and it's all the better for it. Part of the appeal comes from the game's laid-back mood, as in calmly strolling along on a pleasantly lukewarm day, which forms a perfectly realised sense of childhood. The lack of any real depth to its gameplay is bound to turn some players off, but for those willing to give it a chance, Attack of the Friday Monsters provides an incredible story and atmosphere to lose yourself in. Starting out way back in 1987, the game was completely reinvented for the 3DS and revisits the franchise with a bit of a twist. Instead of playing as fan favourite Joe, you instead take up the fight as one of his descendants after you're plunged into the future. Once there, you learn that a rival clan has created an army of futuristic soldiers, with your goal being to stop them dead in their tracks. Now, much of the familiar gameplay mechanics remain, from double jumps to stealth attacks, range and melee, parries, and that famous ninja power which decimates everything in sight. Your main weapons are your katana and kunai, but magic does play a part in completing the game, especially for your first playthrough. It's primarily broken up into 4 categories that include earth, fire, lightning and water, each with their own pros and cons. For example, if you use earth magic, your character is made invincible for a limited amount of time. Fire, on the other, allows you to kill enemies and makes your firepower faster. There's a good balance involved here, and if you don't use magic, you're rewarded a higher amount of points when you finish a level. With more enemies than you can poke a katana at, Shinobi also offers a variety of boss battles throughout the game. There's specific tactics required to defeat each boss, but they are all varied and each offer up a distinct challenge to the player. Now, when it comes to presentation, the 3DS title feels far more polished and realistic, thanks to the use of polygons and texture details. Characters are well animated, and there are some very cool special effects employed in the game. If you're a fan of the series or are simply looking for a new side-scroller to get into, Shinobi will be right up your street. Coming from the makers of Luminous Arc, Stellar Glow turned everything up to 11 with its diverse cast of characters, improved visuals and gameplay that made it a much better offering than what had come before. To be honest, the narrative is rather cliche and once again revolves around a coming of age story, but thankfully the character building is what saves it from becoming an absolute slog. It all revolves around the player having to assemble a group of witches in order to save the world. Most of them are angsty and want nothing to do with other people, so it's up to you to persuade them to interact with other NPCs. Unfortunately, the game sort of penalises you for interacting with the more interesting non-witch characters, because only bonding with them alone gives you their ultimate attacks and abilities, which you can't really unlock through leveling. Even though the premise may be tried and tested, the same can't be said for Stellar Glow's gameplay, as this is where it really comes into its own. All of the battles take place on a grid and are turn-based in nature, but simply having to clear the map of enemies is not always what you'll find yourself doing. There's plenty of objectives that help spice up encounters, such as securing items or making it to a specific point unharmed. But what helps set Stellar apart from many other RPGs is the singing system that's unlocked during the game's story. As you battle, a gauge fills up in the upper left corner of the screen, and once it's full, it allows witches to use their powerful song magic to change the tides of a battle. But that's not everything that'll see you through the adventure in hand. Like most role-playing games, status effects are either completely useless or nearly game-breaking useful. Stellar Glow falls into the latter, as you'll soon find out that taking advantage of the techniques you have can completely cripple certain enemies and even bosses rather quickly. If you've exhausted the usual suspects on the 3DS and are looking to jump into something new and memorable, Stellar Glow will provide that and much more. Ghost Recon Shadow Wars offered up a respectable tactical RPG that largely went by unnoticed. I've often heard it being compared to Advance Wars, as it is a turn-based strategy wargame, and that's a good comparison, but I'd more likely relate it to the Fire Emblem series instead. You have a small force of units that you maintain throughout the story, with the player being tasked with leveling them up and acquiring new skills as the game progresses. You've got 6 in total, with each of them having their own unique skills and functions within the unit, such as the stealthy big boy who deals out incredible amounts of damage, one who can deploy a variety of tech such as turrets, as well as a sniper, a medic and a commando who can all eventually unlock secondary weapons and techniques to help you deal with the onslaught of enemies that come your way. Once in battle, it's all about positioning, establishing line of sight, moving in groups, and more importantly attacking from the right angle. Of course, it's not only about going on the offensive, with there being plenty of opportunities to return fire when attacked, or activate special abilities and hide behind cover when you're under assault. Now, leveling up players is not achieved through experience points. Rather, each mission has certain objectives that will reward stars at the end of combat. These stars can then be applied to any ghost that has been deployed for the mission, with nearly 40 campaign missions as well as optional extras such as the challenge mode and various difficulty settings as well. Shadow Wars offers up some serious bang for your buck. If a challenging tactical game piques your interest and you're looking for something that will last you well over 30 hours, I'd highly recommend this game. Originally released back in 1997 for the Sega Saturn, Soul Hackers is part of the long-running Shin Megami Tensei series, a series known for its unconventional morality-based stories and addictive demon fusion system. SMT has found its way into the hearts of many RPG fans. Now, first things first, it's almost impossible to talk about the 3DS version without mentioning the presentation. And yes, as you can see, the game is incredibly dated. The dungeons are from a simple first-person perspective, which is undeniably bland and repetitive. You'll see the same textures as you traverse the game's various locales, and it's not pretty at all. In battle, the game presents another simple first-person view, common for RPGs from the time of its original release. The graphics are without question Saturn era, and the 3D effect is tacked on with no real effort. But if you're like me and can look past it, you'll find Soul Hackers offers an incredible amount of depth to its gameplay, and in the long run, that is the most important aspect of any game. Now, battles play out in a turn-based fashion, with the player having up to 6 slots to fill with party members, and throughout the game you fight many demons. However, apart from just slapping them down, you can speak to them and try to get them to help you out. Once you get one to join you, then you have another party member. Naturally, each demon has different strengths, weaknesses, stats and skills, and beyond that you can also fuse them together to form new and sometimes more powerful allies. This aspect alone adds a crazy amount of customization to the game, as not only can you fuse demons together, but you can fuse the demon with a weapon to create a new weapon as well. Soul Hackers is one of the best games in the series if you ask me. It was an amazing game back when it originally released on the Saturn, and it still holds up incredibly well to this day on the 3DS. If you can look past its somewhat archaic presentation, Soul Hackers would make a great choice if you're looking for something different to try out. Originally released on the PSP back in 2007, Gurumin flew well under the radar and never really got the attention it deserved. Fast forward a few years later and it was ported to the 3DS, where it could hopefully reach a bigger audience. Now, it's easy to just simply pass off Gurumin as a kids game, and that's no doubt thanks to its rather cartoonish appearance, but doing so would be a mistake, as it's quite easily one of the most enjoyable platforming adventures on handheld. It sees you taking on the role of Parin, a young girl who moves in with her grandfather her in a remote mining town. She's got no friends in this new place, so she sets out to explore and comes across little childlike creatures that live in the area. It's not long until you're helping these little critters defend their realm from an invasion of phantoms. What starts off as a somewhat generic tale soon opens up and offers a ton of personality and likable characters to meet along the way. When it comes to the gameplay, one of the first things many players will notice is just how fluid the controls are. Everything is tight and responsive, which is just what you need when it comes to a platformer that requires precision. Jumping alone isn't going to cut it though, and Parin has a few tricks up her sleeves to counter the phantoms. There's a wide variety of attacks and combos available to you that all increase as you pick up various upgrades for your single weapon, the drill. But it's not only just tied to combat. The drill plays a pivotal role in advancing through the game and can help solve various environmental puzzles that will often have you scratching your head. The enemies, when taken individually, aren't too challenging, but as the game progresses, they come at you in greater numbers and have access to equipment of their own, which includes armor, weapons, and even firearms and bombs. Because of this, the difficulty ramps up nicely throughout the adventure and requires you to constantly be on your toes. Overall, the game isn't perfect, but the fluid movement, smooth combat, and happy-go-lucky art design make Gurumin worthy of a place in your collection as well. Etrian Odyssey seems like a pretty standard RPG. After all, it's got character classes, turn-based gameplay, a level up system, and it's really long. What sets it apart from other JRPGs isn't what you were doing inside battles, it's what you do outside of them. Now the story begins pretty stale. You've arrived in Phasis, a town brimming of life and opportunity. As like many of the other explorers, your party is trying to reach a sacred tree, and that's pretty much the only story you get for the first 20 hours. Unfortunately, the pace of the narrative for the first part of the game can be a turn-off for some, but the gameplay is much more important, so many won't mind it. The gameplay consists of 3 different parts. The first is exploring in your skyship named Big Mama, the second is taking on one of the many caves, and then finally, like any good RPG, team building through battles plays a huge role as well. Etrian Odyssey approaches dungeons very differently, however. Instead of providing players with a map, it expects you to use the touchscreen on the 3DS in order to create your own map while exploring. I found this aspect really engaging, and since you'll be making multiple trips into these areas, it's a good idea to get into the habit of jotting everything down. When it comes to battles, it's all pretty standard, with your characters having all the normal stats such as strength and defense. You'll find yourself leveling up and spending skill points to craft a band of unstoppable allies. There are quite a few classes to choose from as well, and more become available during the game, but there isn't much unique about the battle system itself. Overall, Etrian Odyssey 4 is a challenging but rewarding RPG that's still worth going back to today. Well, that does it for today's video. Keep an eye out for part 2 as that will be coming up soon, so don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell to get notified. You can follow me on all of the socials to stay up to date, as well as join our growing community on Discord to meet many like-minded gamers to continue the conversation with. I'd like to give a special shout out to our Patreon supporters Rhino, Skill Jim, Nano, Steve, Richard, Amy, Daniel, Quinn, Dio, Alex and Paddy J for their continued support that helps make these videos possible. If you're interested in joining my Discord or supporting the channel through Patreon to gain access to exclusive videos and giveaways for as little as $1 per month, you'll find the links in the description. As always, thanks for taking the time to watch the video. I'll catch you next time.